We hear a parable of the vineyard in both the first reading from Isaiah and the gospel today. And it speaks about how the Lord establishes this vineyard, and he takes great care to tend it so that it can produce fruit, and he expects it to produce fruit. And it says in the first reading to Isaiah that the vineyard is to produce justice. That's what the Lord is looking for. And yet the Lord finds bloodshed and an outcry of sins against justice. So I want to look a little bit at the virtue of justice today, especially in light of the riots that we've seen in our country, from Portland to Louisville to Minneapolis to Atlanta to Boston to countless cities across the country. This does not look like the vineyard our Lord desires for us to have. And something is going terribly wrong within our country. And I think it's important for the voice of the church to speak strongly and to give moral guidance and to help to discern and figure out what is going on, what's causing the situation we're in, and to help us to chart a path that's going to produce justice and a flourishing society rather than the violence and the discord that we're seeing. Racial tensions are a complex issue, and there's a lot of dynamics going on. But the first thing for us to recognize is that we are all part of one human family. And we all share a common dignity because every single human being is created in the image of God and is loved by God. And that's where our dignity comes from. So every human life has the same dignity. And any form of racism, the church teaches us, is sinful and is incompatible with a just society. And as members of the church, we should have a special appreciation for this because our church is worldwide. We have people that are members of the Catholic Church from every background, every culture, every language across the face of the earth, united together into one church. And so any sins of racism should be confessed, and if they cause serious injury, those are grave sins. But I think in addition to sins of racism, when so many people are marching in the streets, it's important to listen to their frustration because there are real discrepancies in the environment that people live in within our country, the opportunities that they have, and just the basic safety in the environment that they live in. And it's important for us to recognize those and be attuned to those. Another dynamic that's going on that's important to recognize is that there are people who are deliberately adding fuel to the racial fires by labeling people who disagree with them politically as racist. And in this racially charged rhetoric, it causes tension, and a lot of people now think that anyone who disagrees with them is a racist, and it's causing tension within families, within workplaces, and it's driving a lot of discord that I'm sure a lot of us have experienced within society. And just a few examples. Saw that Judge Amy Coney Barrett was called a racist because 2 of her 7 children were adopted from Haiti. They were saying, well, you adopt black kids, obviously you're a white imperialist, and that's racist. Absolutely ridiculous, unfounded charges. And I heard about a professional athlete who was kicked off his team and lost his job and possibly his career because he was asked if he supported Trump, and he said yes. And so they labeled him as a racist. They said, you're too divisive, and he lost his job. He's off the team. That the Proud Boys were labeled as white supremacists. This is a group, I don't support them, but they publicly renounce white supremacy, and they're led by an African Latino. And yet they're accused of being white supremacists. Just these charges that are just unfounded and ridiculous, and people are just labeling anyone who doesn't agree with them as a racist. If someone has a racist policy that they're advocating, like if someone's saying that minorities should lose the right to vote, then call out the policy. But these blanket attacks on people are sinful. We call that calumny or slander. And it's a grave sin against justice and truth and charity. Objectively, it's a mortal sin because people have a right to their good name. People have a right to their integrity, and to go around and accuse people of different crimes or sins in order to destroy their good name is a sin against justice. And so my advice is stop watching any media that's going around slandering people and calling them racist. Politicians that are doing that, that's not appropriate behavior. Don't support media who's doing that with your ratings. And certainly on our part, we should never be participating in that slander because that's sinful and it's something that needs to be confessed. There's also this white privilege ideology that's spreading. And it's being taught in universities and a lot of workplaces now. But they want us to view everything through the lens of racial oppression. That the whole history of our country is about white versus black and who's oppressing who and who's forcing their will on other people. And this is not a Christian worldview, and it was never the goal of the civil rights movement. And in his famous speech, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. said, "I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character." That was the goal of the civil rights movement. And so all these attacks against people, the slander that's going on, and these ideologies that see everything through the lens of race, we need to reject all of that. A third element for us to recognize in the midst of all this chaos, there are groups that are actively encouraging racial violence. They want the violence, they want riots, and they want them to be as bad as possible, and they want the violence to spread. These riots could have been stopped in 30 minutes, and yet people are allowing them to go on for months. African American neighborhoods are being destroyed, they're being smashed and burned to the ground, and then there's calls to defund police, which is just going to make all the violence worse if you take away any law enforcement. And there's police officers that are scared to police because they fear being targeted as a racist, and crime is skyrocketing. None of this is good for minority communities and for those living in inner cities. And so the question for us to ask is, who is it that thinks this is a good idea? And who is encouraging this and allowing it to go on? And what's behind it? Those are the Marxists. They want revolution rather than reform. And these are the radical progressives on the left wing and those who are sympathizing with them. And they're very active in the mainstream media. They're big in the large tech companies that are controlling the flow of information on the internet. They're active in universities and what they're teaching our young people. And they're certainly very active in politics. This is a very dangerous faction in our society that's promoting violence. And it's important for us to, especially during an election year, not to support them and to be very careful to distinguish who are the people that are fostering and enabling this violence and who are the people who are against that. Our nation has come so far since the 1960s. Who would have ever thought at that time that we would have an African American on the Supreme Court or one elected as a 2-term president? Or senators or congressmen. Our schools are integrated, our sports, our workforce, our military. We've come very far in our country, and now is not the time for us to resort to violence. There's better paths and better movements that are out there. The most important thing in these neighborhoods that are struggling economically is to support the growth of churches. Because churches build strong communities of virtue, and it strengthens the family unit, which is absolutely essential for people's communities. And rather than burning down our cities, there's other people who are supporting opportunity zones. They've invested over $75 billion into depressed areas to create jobs and businesses and new opportunities. And rather than disbanding police, there's those who are supporting the best possible training for our police officers and encouraging best practices. And so when we see all this racial tension and violence going around us, it's important for us to be prudent and to recognize what's going on. Where are the real problems, and where are people who are fanning the flames through slandering other people and through encouraging violence and injustice? Because we need to be careful to chart a course that's not one of violence and justice, but one that upholds the dignity of the human person. One that's going to create a vineyard of authentic justice for our Lord. One where all that is honorable, all that is just, all that is pure, and all that is lovely can flourish.